The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute each. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you to all of you for being here. And without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. The Chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. In our fervor to repudiate all things Ahmadinejad and force ourselves into believing things in Iran are set to change, the West has rushed to anoint Hassan Rouhani as the moderate hope who will ease tensions between Iran and the West. And in wanting this change so badly, we've quietly lulled ourselves into submission, accepting that a Rouhani victory was the choice of the Iranian people who wanted change, unwilling to see that this was still just a victory for the supreme leader and the regime. The people never really had a choice. They were forced to choose from one of Khomeini's candidates. And this is what Khomeini wanted. The whole thing was rigged from the start. Khomeini is once again playing games with the West. In Rouhani, he now has the perfect opportunity to coax the United States and the international community to ease up on sanctions, while using Rouhani as the fall guy should public opinion turn. The regime in Tehran will use his election as an opportunity to undermine support for sanctions and buy time to fight back the effects the sanctions have had on Iran while marching forward with its nuclear program. And we must see this for what it is and not get caught up in the enthusiasm that has accompanied nearly every presidential election in Iran since the 1990s. Because if history has shown us anything, it is that these elections tend to bring with them a false hope that the regime is cracking, when in fact it is just cementing its control. These elections were anything but free and fair. It is not fair when half of the population is disqualified from running because they are of the wrong gender or they are a religious minority. And they aren't free when the candidates are handpicked by the regime, assuring that no matter who wins, the regime has their man in office. And that is what unfolded in Iran last Friday. The people didn't have a free choice, and they got stuck with Rouhani, the consummate regime insider. I would urge caution to those so desperate to label Hassan Rouhani as a reformist or moderate. He is a man who has been in the core of the inner circle of the regime since the beginning, having been close with the founding clerics of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, including the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, and how quickly those who need Rouhani to be something that he will never be whitewash his past so that his election fits this reformist narrative. They seem to have forgotten that in 1999, Rouhani, serving the regime, led a relentless and violent crackdown on a student uprising. During a pro-regime rally in response to the students, Rouhani reportedly declared, quote, "From today, our people shall witness how in the arena our law enforcement force shall deal with these opportunist and riotous elements if they simply dare to show their faces," end quote. This speech was reportedly followed by an IRGC force storming through university campuses, arresting, torturing, and murdering those who sought reform. And now this is what we have pinned our hopes to as a reformer in Iran. I urge all of us to remember that ultimately the power in Iran rests with Khomeini, the IRGC, and the regime. I fear that we will be too eager to lift the pressure on the regime under the false narrative of reform and moderation. The U.S. position must be clear: no concessions, no rewards, no easing of sanctions. The U.S. must not give up any ground unless the regime takes verifiable steps to halt its enrichment and dismantle its nuclear program. Let us not forget that he was part of the regime that concealed its nuclear program from the world for 20 years before becoming the face of that program as Iran's top nuclear negotiator. And while many point to the halting of enrichment in 2004 under his watch as positive signs, I'd advise you to use caution with this rationale. This was a delay tactic that the regime and even Rouhani himself had admitted to using in order to push the nuclear program forward. During the campaign, Rouhani reportedly bragged that under his watch, Iran didn't suspend the program. No, indeed, they had completed it. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to our ranking member, my friend Ted Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. Last Friday, the Iranian people participated in what was expected to be an uninteresting election with a predetermined result to replace the pugnacious and repugnant Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Instead, the Iranian people rallied around the token moderate, Hassan Rouhani, proving their desire to chart a different course for their future and improve Iran's relations with the international community. And while I commend the Iranian people for their inspiring civic participation, this election should not be viewed as the birth of Jeffersonian democracy in Iran. Before even one ballot was cast, the Supreme Leader went to great lengths to ensure that one of his own proxies would be elected by disqualifying hundreds of qualified candidates. Even regime stalwart Rafsanjani was disqualified, thus signifying that political space in Iran had contracted to the point where it appeared that Iranian elections were little more than Ayatollah Khamenei's personal selection. Furthermore, this election occurred in a staggeringly repressive environment. In the weeks leading up to the election, the regime harassed pro-reform activists, throttled the internet, blocked foreign Persian language television stations, shut down university campuses, denied permissions to poll workers, and conducted cyber attacks against numerous Iranian opposition sites. Yet in spite of brutal repression, we saw the Iranian people again find a small opportunity to have their voices heard and advocate for change in Iran. Of course, you can't think of Rouhani's victory without remembering those who demanded their voices be heard in 2009, when we witnessed massive rallies against the status quo that were brutally suppressed by the government. However, as we learned this weekend, the Green Movement and the people's desire for change endures. Presented with a small opening, the people delivered a powerful message that the Iranian people want to shape their own future. Now, Rouhani campaigned on a platform of reforming the economy, improving relations with the international community, and freeing political prisoners, all of which challenges the status quo. At a rally of nearly 9,000 supporters days before the election, he told the crowd, "If you want Iranian officials to stop presenting inaccurate economic data, if you want the rial to regain its value, if you want the Iranian passport to be respected again, come to the ballot boxes." This seemingly grow-for-broke strategy created a last-minute surge in massive public support that persuaded a security-conscious regime to concede a Rouhani win. And as impressive as the civic activism is, Iran will be judged on its actions. We know that Rouhani is only a moderate candidate on the Iranian continuum, and that he has made hostile comments about the United States and about Israel. We know that despite the attempts to paint him as a reformer, he still is a regime insider, intensely loyal to the Supreme Leader. He has not disavowed Iran's nuclear ambitions, far from it, and we know that the reformist agenda have been stymied by the regime in the past. We know that a different president won't change the fact that the Supreme Leader will continue to have veto power over the issues of foremost concern to the United States and to our allies. The U.S. has worked hard to create an unprecedented international community united against Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program, and it remains to be seen how a new president will affect that dynamic. But one thing is clear: being deferential to the Supreme Leader or being silent about human rights abuses will not compel Iran to moderate its nuclear policies. I hope the Iranian regime will heed the will of the Iranian people and make choices that create a better future for all Iranians. It's time for this regime to engage with the U.S. government and our allies in a substantial way on the nuclear issue. It's time for Iran to end its support of terrorism, end its support of Assad's murderous regime, and respect the basic rights of its people. Coming into this election, we all expected that the Supreme Leader would promote a yes man, like nuclear negotiator Jalili. But as we witnessed, the status quo is no longer sustainable. Many analysts have said that Iran's #1 priority is to ensure regime survival. Well, if this brutal regime wants to survive while ruling over a young population frustrated with everyday life, then it must fundamentally alter its behavior. Otherwise, the election of this seemingly moderate candidate won't yield the lasting results that the Iranian people so powerfully advocated for at the polls. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing this further with our distinguished panel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. I will now recognize members for any one-minute statements they would like to make. We will start with Mr. Health, Mr. Kissinger from Illinois.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for coming. It's going to be a very interesting thing. I think if we were 10 years ago right now and this had happened, I think we'd be in a much different position. We could say, hey, let's see how this kind of plays out. Let's see if this guy really is a moderate. Let's see if Iran ends up engaging with the West. I think our big concern, as you've heard from everybody that's spoken so far, is Iran is on the edge of attaining a nuclear weapon and being a major game changer in the region. And so while I really want to celebrate a potentially positive move here, I remain very, very concerned that this is either a stall tactic or that the train has already left the station and we're going to see Iran attain a nuclear weapon. So I only have a minute to speak, but I just want to add myself to the voice of what I think you'll hear on a lot of folks in the panel, which is we cannot allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and we cannot allow this to be an impetus for saying, well, we're going to soften our stance, we're going to back off a little bit, we're going to re-engage diplomatically because they really want to make a difference. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cicilline, America's Mayor.
Thank you, Chairman Ross-Leighton and Ranking Member Deutsch, for holding today's hearing on this important issue. The continuing threat that Iran poses to international peace and stability remains a paramount concern of the United States and the entire world, and addressing that threat must be a top U.S. foreign policy priority. Over the weekend, the people of Iran elected former chief nuclear negotiator Hassan Rouhani as the nation's next president. And although he's considered much more moderate and reform-minded than his predecessor, with Rouhani's support, Iran continues its pursuit of nuclear weapons in defiance of international sanctions. And while he has been hailed by some as a champion of reform, Rouhani was nevertheless selected with the final approval of the supreme leader, who remains in full control of Iran's nuclear program and military. As my colleagues have described this morning, to describe the presidential election as full and fair elections would be a gross overstatement. But nonetheless, understanding the impact of Iran's elections on the Iranian people, as well as the rest of the world, is critical, and I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses this morning. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. Mr. Cotton of Arizona Arkansas, is recognized.
I'm sure Arizona is a wonderful state, but not quite as great as Arkansas. The Iranian elections were not free and fair. They were a sham election in a sham democracy. Iran remains a totalitarian theocracy. All candidates were screened by the mullahs, which also censored and suppressed the media during the so-called campaign. Mr. Rouhani is not a moderate. He was part of the 1979 ruling clique. He's a devoted follower of Ayatollah Khomeini. He led the crackdown in the 1999 student uprising, and as a nuclear negotiator for Iran's regime, he often deceived and dissembled with the West. If Iran wants to rejoin the civilized world, it's very clear what they should do, not have sham elections. They should denuclearize in an objective, verifiable way subject to international inspections. They should withdraw all support for Bashar al-Assad, including the 4,000 troops they've sent to Syria to support him. They should stop funding and arming Hezbollah. They should quit exporting terrorism around the world, including against our troops in Afghanistan. They should recognize Israel's right to exist. They should respect the civil, political, and religious liberties of their own people, and they should hold a genuine election, not a sham election.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. The election of Hassan Rouhani begins a new chapter for the Iranian people. Receiving over 50% of the votes in a six-man race establishes a mandate to govern for Rouhani. As we look forward to the possibility of a more open and free society with Iran, we must also recognize the reality that presidential power within Iran is only a small portion of the true power structure, which continues to be led by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Rouhani has been described as a reformer who ran on a platform of restoring pride for the Iranian people in their government and economy. Previous to his election, however, Rouhani served as the lead negotiator for Iran from 2003 to 2005. He was seen as diplomatic, but his concessions to the West in proposing a suspension of Iran's nuclear program ultimately got him removed by then-President Ahmadinejad. This lesson was well ingrained in President Rouhani, and with a weakened ability to bring substantive change to Iran's ongoing nuclear activities in his election, while preferable for the Iranian people, will not likely yield a productive shift from past Iranian policy. I look forward to hearing from the panel with their thoughts and insights for what, if any, potentially transformative policies might be looked for from President Rouhani's election. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Meadows of North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm happy to have the opportunity to hear more about the recent elections. Thank you for being here, what it means to the people of Iran and to the Middle East as a whole. I wish I could say that I was optimistic, that we're going to see real change. But from what I've seen so far, that's just not going to be the case. The Supreme Leader is still in place. He's still hostile to U.S. interest, and specifically to the continued existence of Israel. And as long as the ruling regime remains with no checks and on their power, it's going to be hard to be optimistic about Iran. This has been true for years, but it's even more relevant as they're currently fighting a proxy war to uphold the Assad regime in Syria. So we need to really reevaluate this. I look forward to your testimony, and I'm looking forward to a future with a stable and truly democratic Iran. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Vargas of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member and distinguished witnesses, for holding this hearing on such a timely topic. As we know, the election in Iran last Friday resulted in a presidential victory for Hassan Rouhani, who has been deemed by a moderate voice among the fundamentalist cleric who served the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. As we temper our expectations to the realities of the rigged electoral process in Iran, there remains many questions moving forward. We must steadfastly maintain our strategic goal of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Will this former head nuclear negotiator provide a space for an international deal, or will he continue to be the party to the delay and deceive tactics we have seen throughout the years? As the Obama administration moves to arm the rebels in Syria, will Iran continue to bolster the Assad regime and use its proxy for international terrorism? Finally, our friend and greatest ally in the region, Israel, has expressed skepticism about any potential change of course and has rightly stated that Iran will be judged by its actions, and we will judge them by their actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Congresswoman Meng of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member, and our witnesses for being here today. We were all surprised by the nature and result of the recent election in Iran. The President-elect Hassan Rouhani is the most moderate of the candidates selected by the Guardian Council, but is in every respect, a regime insider. The Iranian threat is as grave as it was last week, and the centrifuges are still spinning. But the question here is not so much who Mr. Rouhani is or where he has been, but rather it is where he is going. As we saw with perestroika 30 years ago, a tinge of freedom, a tinge of moderation can yield far more when coupled with popular will. I look forward to exploring this possibility today and yield back my time.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and welcome to the panel. I think all of us obviously are interested this morning in who is this new cleric president of Iran, Rouhani. Given his pedigree, it is he's been referred to as a moderate, but he certainly has impeccable credentials from the revolutionary point of view and from the theocratic state point of view. And so just how much change can we really expect? And how much of a risk is it for us to fall into the trap of buying more time for the nuclear development because a moderate has been elected to the presidency once again? And so I think all of us are interested in hearing your views about that and engaging with you as the United States tries to think through its policy in this post-election period. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Thank you for excellent opening statements from all of our members. And now we're so pleased to introduce our witnesses. First, we welcome Mr. Ali Nader, a senior international policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and the author of Iran's 2013 presidential election, Its Meaning and Implications. Pretty timely. He has published numerous titles on Iran's internal politics And prior to joining RAN, Mr. Nader served as a research analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis. Thank you, sir. Next, we welcome Dr. Suzanne Maloney, a senior fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, where her research focuses on Iran and the Persian Gulf energy. Prior to joining the Brookings Institution, Dr. Maloney served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and directed the 2004 Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on U.S. policy toward Iran. Next, we welcome Mr. Karim Sadjadpour. And because your name is a little difficult for me, my staff made sure that your name is mentioned in every sentence of your introduction. So, he's a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment. Prior to this, Mr. Sadjadpour was the chief Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group. In 2007, Mr. Sadjadpour was named a Young Global Leader by World Economic Forum in Davos. Mr. Sadjadpour is a board member of the Banu Foundation, an organization dedicated to empowering women worldwide. Thank you to our panelists. Without objection, as I said, your full prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and we will ask you to please sum in 5 minutes. Mr. Nader, we will start with you.
Thank you, Chairman Ross-Leighton and Ranking Member Deutsch and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for allowing me to appear before you today to speak about the Iranian presidential election and policy options for the United States going forward. I would like to make 3 points before offering U.S. policy recommendations. First, Hassan Rouhani's election as president demonstrates the Iranian people's frustrations and deep opposition to their leader's decisions. His election is a refusal of the policy of so-called resistance on the nuclear program pursued by Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, which has led to Iran's growing isolation and its economic devastation. Second, the election may also show that U.S. pressure against Iran is beginning to pay off. Iran's economic crisis played a significant role in Rouhani's election. Iran's continued progress on the nuclear program has been very costly. According to Iran's oil minister, energy exports have declined by 40%. The Iranian government has reported an inflation rate of 30%, although some economists claim it is much higher. Iran's currency, the rial, lost 80% of its value in 2012 alone. The livelihood of many Iranians, including the middle class, is in grave jeopardy. Khamenei and Ahmadinejad's policies, especially on the nuclear program, threaten to unravel the Islamic Republic. Khamenei could be seeking a way out of the crisis, and he could be working through Rouhani. Third, Rouhani's presidency may provide a better opportunity to solve the nuclear crisis through diplomacy. His past experience as a capable nuclear negotiator and a moderate on foreign policy is encouraging. But not all of Iran's policies may change. For example, Iran is unlikely to abandon its support for the Syrian regime. Rouhani will nevertheless have an opportunity to reshape Iran's position on the nuclear program, as he will appoint Iran's nuclear negotiator and other key figures. There's still enough time and space for the U.S. policy of sanctions and diplomacy to succeed. But negotiations between the P5+1, which is composed of the permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany, and Iran, could fail if the Iranian regime perceives sanctions as being geared toward regime implosion and overthrow, rather than a way to achieve a diplomatic solution. U.S. policy has to be balanced to include not only pressures, but a dignified way for the regime to compromise. This means a cap on Iranian enrichment, intrusive inspections, limits on Iranian nuclear facilities, and a limited stockpile of enriched uranium. In return, the P5+1 would accept Iran's declared right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes and would lift the most onerous sanctions. Any future sanctions should be specifically be designed to impact the regime's nuclear calculus. In addition, they should be reversible in the event of a nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1. This means that they should not be defined by issues related to human rights or Iran's regional behavior. Moreover, the United States should have the freedom to issue waivers, when necessary, for third-party countries regarding their compliance with sanctions. This allows Washington to maintain the impressive international coalition which has isolated the Iranian regime. It is important that future sanctions target the regime as much as possible. Sanctions have so far hurt the regime, but they have also caused suffering among the Iranian people. The United States should seek more creative ways in targeting the regime. Recent U.S. Treasury sanctions against Khamenei's business empire are to be commended in this regard. Furthermore, the United States must ensure that sanctions do not lead to a shortage of food and medicine in Iran. This would be used as a propaganda tool by the regime and could erode Iranians' goodwill toward the United States. While sanctions should not be tied to human rights, the United States and its allies must be more vigorous in highlighting Iran's human rights abuses while opening better channels of communication with the Iranian people. This election has demonstrated that the Islamic Republic, although authoritarian, is responsive to pressure. Washington should engage Rouhani before it pursues additional sanctions. If the regime does not respond, then it will be met with greater pressure. The future of Iran is impossible to predict, but time is on the side of the United States and the Iranian people. The United States still has the opportunity to resolve the nuclear impasse diplomatically while it helps the Iranian people realize a better future for their country. Again, Chairman Ross-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing me to speak to you about this important issue. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Maloney.
Chairman Ross-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here today and discuss the recently concluded Iranian presidential election with you. Obviously, Iran is at the forefront of all of our security interests. This election does not change any of those interests or any of our concerns about Iranian behavior, but it does offer the possibility of new momentum in addressing them. In my testimony, I will highlight the importance of elections, the office of the presidency, speak for a few moments about why it is we think Rouhani won and why it is he was allowed to win, and then conclude with a few remarks about U.S. policy moving forward. Many, even in this room, have dismissed the irrelevance of Iranian electoral processes and institutions. I fully understand why, and yet I respectfully disagree. In fact, it's a misreading of Iran's complicated domestic dynamics to dismiss its elections or its representative institutions as mere window dressing. Elections, even ones that are highly orchestrated, as the ones in the Islamic Republic are, represent critical junctures in the life cycle of political systems. In Iran, they have repeatedly sent the revolutionary system careening in new directions. The election that just concluded in Iran reinforced the subversive utility of semi-democratic institutions, even in authoritarian systems. Iran's elections matter because they provide openings for candidates to challenge the official narrative, as we heard time and time again in this campaign on the nuclear issue. They matter because they enable journalists and crowds of people to come and speak about issues that have been off limits for public debate for many years, including the arrest and detention of the two candidates from the 2009 election. Elections release genies from bottles, as one of the foremost Iranian dissidents has said. We also know that the presidency matters. If nothing else, we have learned from the past 8 years about Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is that Iran's presidency is important to the way its policy is conducted. The president controls budgets and institutions. More importantly, he controls the context for Iran's internal and domestic politics, but also for its relationships with the world. We would not have the sanctions regime that we have today were it not for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Let me just say a few words about why it is I think Rouhani won. First, he ran a very smart campaign. He appealed to Iranian young people. He pushed the bounds on the nuclear issue in a way that no one really anticipated, and he created the opportunity for, in fact, conservatives to pile on to this particular issue in an amazing televised public debate that was on state television for 4.5 hours, in which all of the candidates effectively said, what we're doing now is not working, we need a deal. We have never, in fact, heard anything like this from the Islamic Republic before. Rouhani, in fact, managed to do what the reformists have been trying to do in Iran for more than a decade, which is to create a coalition that can actually advance their interests. They did this by banding together with centrists, with pragmatists, with conservatives. Really, Rouhani is not a reformist by any stretch of the imagination. He's very much a pragmatic conservative, and his election represents a new alliance, a new political force in Iran. He also benefited from conservative disarray. None of this really explains, however, why it is that Khamenei let him win. I think many people, and certainly the prevailing narrative in the press, is that this was just an explosion and Iranians once again told their leader something they didn't want to hear. I think that's quite possible, and certainly the role of the Iranian people and their unhappiness about the horrendous economic conditions is very important. But I think there's also an argument to be made, and I can sketch it out in greater depth during the discussion period, that in fact the regime is looking for a way out of the box that it's in. That in fact what they've done is what they did toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, which is to try to empower a fixer, someone who can get them out of a very dire situation. For the U.S., this is an opportunity, but also one that offers no easy path forward. We see confirmation, as Ali has just said, that the U.S. strategy is working to a point. The point of a dual-track policy that we've had in place for many years now has been to create the political will for a deal on the nuclear issue, and we know that that exists. That's huge, and it's a tremendous opportunity. Of course, Rouhani's election will inevitably lead to sanctions erosion and other challenges for U.S. policy. We have to be prepared that the United States will negotiate seriously, that we can offer tangible rewards in exchange for confirmed overtures from the Iranians, specific concessions on the nuclear program. Congress's role in this moment of opportunity is extremely important. For Washington to greet the empowerment of the first serious moderate, someone who has an apparent mandate to make a deal on the nuclear issue with a new raft of sanctions, would be a disaster. U.S. policymakers should appreciate that Rouhani will experience real constraints. He doesn't have an easy path forward, but this is someone who's been dubbed the Sheikh of diplomacy. He may just be the right man to do the deal we've been waiting for. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maloney. Mr. Sadjadpour.
Thank you, Chairman Ross-Leighton and members of the subcommittee. I think the election of Hassan Rouhani was another important and humble reminder that there are no experts on Iranian politics, only students of Iranian politics. And it was another reminder that presidential elections in Iran tend to be unfree, unfair, and unpredictable, as Representative Deutsch can attest by my briefing before the election. I think what was most surprising about Hassan Rouhani's victory wasn't that he received the most votes. He was the lone quote-unquote moderate candidate on a ballot which was amongst 5 hardline representatives of the government. But what was most surprising, as Suzanne mentioned, was that he was allowed to win. And I think, as many of you have said here today, Rouhani's victory, I think, can be better interpreted as a reflection of the tremendous popular discontent in Iran, rather than a deep-seated affection for the candidate of Hassan Rouhani himself. We did see after the election that Iranians reacted jubilantly, and I would describe this as the equivalent of a population experiencing a light rain after 8 years of drought. When you do live in Iran, it makes a difference who your president is. During the era of Mohammad Khatami, it was a country which was more politically and socially tolerant. There was a much better economy than under Ahmadinejad. So from the vantage point of Iranian citizens, it does make a difference who their president is. But as everyone has said here today, Hassan Rouhani is no Nelson Mandela. He's not even Mohammad Khatami. He's someone who's not committed to reforming the system. He is a consummate regime insider who is committed to the preservation of the Islamic Republic. But I think there's an important caveat here, which is that Rouhani comes from the tradition in Iran of the pragmatic conservatives, who, again, they are deeply committed to the revolution, to the maintenance of the Islamic Republic. But they believe that in order to preserve the regime, Iran needs to privilege economic expediency over revolutionary ideology. And I think this will probably put him in contrast to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's long believed that compromising on revolutionary principles would actually, could possibly unravel the system rather than strengthen it. Let me move to a couple thoughts on U.S. policy. I think the discussion on U.S. policy toward Iran is nicely framed by 2 quotes from Henry Kissinger, who said, quote, "There are few nations in the world with whom the United States has more common interests and less reason to quarrel than Iran, but Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause." And I think under a Rouhani presidency, as much as there is a popular desire for change in Iran when it comes to the strategic principles of the Islamic Republic, namely resistance towards the United States and toward Israel. Rouhani's will or ability to change those principles is very unclear. But I would say one thing about Iran, and that is that Iran is one of the very few, if only, countries in the Middle East in which America's strategic interest and its democratic values align rather than clash. If you look at a lot of the other countries in the Middle East, particularly in the Arab world, more representative systems in those countries actually produce less tolerant governments and governments which are less sympathetic to the United States. And I think that is the exception in Iran. And for that reason, I think it's imperative for us to think more creatively about ways to facilitate political change in Iran beyond just sanctions. And I would argue that the single most important thing the United States can do to facilitate genuine political change in Iran is to inhibit the Iranian regime's ability to control information and communication. And in this context, I think one thing which is absolutely critical, which we haven't fully taken advantage of, is our Voice of America Persian News Network. This is something which has the potential to reach 25 to 30 million Iranians, but it's woefully underperforming. It doesn't have nearly the popularity or the professionalism as the BBC Persian television service, which played an integral role in these elections. So I think that if there's one thing Congress can do, it's to spearhead the reform and the privatization of Voice of America's Persian News Network. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent testimony to all of you. It is my pleasure, before I begin my questioning, to recognize the delegation of women parliamentarians that we have to the right, to our right. They're from Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Kenya, and Mongolia. They are here to learn about our democracy, and they're touring Capitol Hill today to observe several hearings. I had the pleasure of speaking to them yesterday afternoon, and they asked very interesting questions about our democratic process, such as it is. So thank you so much. Let's give them all a welcome. Thank you, ladies. I want to touch on the role of the President and the office's relationship with the Supreme Leader. The power of the Supreme Leader greatly outweighs that of the office of the President. The Supreme Leader controls the military, the media, the judicial branch. Over time, the Supreme Leader has exerted even more influence and control over the most powerful institutions in Iran by directly appointing their leaders, institutions like the Guardian Council, the Revolutionary Guards, and it is the Supreme Leader who has the final say in virtually every decision that impacts Iran's nuclear program, Iran's involvement in Syria, any other important foreign policy decision. So when we look at the election of Rouhani, I see a man who was selected by an entity controlled by Khamenei, and I see a man who has been part of the Islamic regime in Iran since its beginning. So I ask, knowing what we know about the power structure in Iran and Rouhani's background as a regime loyalist who was handpicked to run by the regime, what should we expect from him to be able to implement democratic reforms, let's say, or bring an end to human rights abuses, discrimination against women, against ethnic and religious minorities? And does he view the U.S.-Israel relationship with the same contempt as Khamenei, and will he continue to spread terror across the region through Hezbollah? And to revisit the hope and optimism theme, for decades now, every time there's an election in Iran, we hear that Iran is on the cusp of change, the reforms are on their way, but hope fades and we see a resurgent regime further cemented into power. What can we expect that this time it will be different? And then lastly, where's Ahmadinejad? What role will he play? Is he an outcast? Will he have a role to play even if, or is it an empty office? Mr. Nader.
I think that's the key question. How much power will Rouhani have? How much leeway will Khamenei give him? It's true that Rouhani is not a reformer. We can't expect major changes in Iran under his presidency. We can't expect an improvement in human rights necessarily, or an improvement really in social freedoms, maybe slightly. However, his goal is not to really change Iran domestically as much as it is to alleviate Iran's external pressure. Ayatollah Khamenei, of course, is the supreme leader, the supreme authority in Iran. The Revolutionary Guards are very powerful. Both institutions are largely unelected and largely unaccountable. But I think it's interesting that Rouhani was allowed to win. He is a regime insider. He is a supreme leader's representative on the National Security Council. But Rouhani provides an opportunity for Khamenei to exit the crisis that Iran is facing currently.
Let me just interrupt you to get the others a chance. Dr. Maloney and Mr. Sadjadpour.
Very quickly, I think Rouhani has been elected to run a national unity government. His priority will be very much on the economy, which effectively means getting a nuclear deal. It's ironic because this is the one issue on which he's been vilified by hardliners for a decade, and yet I think this is his mandate. It means he will be very cautious about touching other issues like Syria, certainly like anything to do with Iran's support for terrorism.
So he will concentrate on the nuclear program because that's been looked upon as his weak part.
He will concentrate on it because it's the only way he can solve the economic problems of the country. He will also have, I think, an onus on him to do something in terms of his promises to release political prisoners, and specific to that, Mousavi and Karoubi, the two candidates from 2009.
Yes. Thank you.
One interesting tidbit about Rouhani is when you look at his nuclear team, when he was chief nuclear negotiator, there was 3 men, Javad Zarif, Hossein Mousavian, and a guy called Cyrus Nasri. All of them were U.S. educated. They all came from merchant backgrounds, not ideological backgrounds. So these folks, when you speak to them privately, they're not the death to America rigid ideologues. I think they're interested in Iran, which again pursues economic interests over ideological interests always. But they're certainly not interested in genuine democracy and opening up the system, because I think they understand that would be a threat to their interests.
And Ahmadinejad, where will he be relegated to?
Hopefully, he will have no role in Iran in the future. Ahmadinejad made a lot of enemies, so he has to be very careful what he does from now on.
Good. Dr. Maloney?
He's already been called before the court and will have probably a difficult time either staying out of prison or finding some new post in the Islamic Republic. He's persona non grata.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Mr. Deutsch?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I also want to thank the witnesses for really enlightening testimony, and I'd extend my welcome to the visiting delegation as well. It's wonderful to have you here. Less than a week ago, it seemed that most Iran analysts believed the Supreme Leader would cement his control over the system by rigging the election to ensure that a compliant conservative like Jalili would become the president. Yet days before the election, he gave a speech encouraging even those who do not support the Islamic system to vote in the election. And it now appears that the Supreme Leader made the calculated decision to acquiesce to the will of the Iranian people. Dr. Maloney, you talked about empowering a fixer. That may be the case, and if so, I'd ask why he did this. But just to go on, I'm not sure if it's a reaction to not wanting to further upset a young and volatile electorate like he did in 2009, or, and I'd like all of you to chime in on this, is the Supreme Leader, is there a possibility that the Supreme Leader is not empowering a president who can come in and do a deal, but the Supreme Leader instead seeks to undermine the united international coalition against Iran's nuclear program that currently exists? For instance, Mr. Nader spoke about putting what a deal would look like with a cap on enrichment and a limited stockpile of enriched uranium and intrusive inspections. But now that we have a moderate president, no longer spewing bellicose statements like Ahmadinejad did, will countries like Russia and China, for example, be willing to accept a deal under Rouhani that we wouldn't accept under Ahmadinejad? So what if they what if they offer less, but it comes without the venom that came with Ahmadinejad? Or what if they offer to minimize their stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, but they don't have the rigorous inspections and the safeguards that would stop their long-term nuclear weapons development? Would a deal like that potentially split the P5+1 unity due to negotiations fatigue and this sense of relief that we have that no one has to deal with Ahmadinejad any longer? Let's start with that. Dr. Maloney, I'll start with you.
I think we should have no illusions about Rouhani's level of flexibility or his degree of authority on this issue. But I think it's notable that he published a memoir which created a sensation within Iran, and a number of people in this town and others have read it, in which he revealed an enormous amount of information and self-criticism about Iran's approach to the nuclear issue. So for that reason, I don't think he's there as a patsy or a dupe, but I also think he will not drive an easy bargain. I've spoken to the Europeans who dealt with him when he was in charge of this brief, and they found him quite frustrating. They didn't enjoy the experience of negotiating across the table from him. But I think Iran today is in a very different set of circumstances than it was in 2003 when the leadership was watching U.S. moves in Iraq. The economy, as Ali and Karim have both indicated, has suffered grievously as a result of the sanctions. And I think it's quite clear that they are looking for some mechanism that won't just erode the compliance with sanctions, because that's insufficient. What they really need is the relaxation and specific removal of sanctions.
Right, but Mr. Sadjadpour, is there a possibility that they could get that by giving up less, given who the spokesperson is now, who the negotiating partner is?
That's certainly plausible in that at the moment, I've noticed just in the last few days, there have already been statements from Russian, Chinese, and European officials, current European foreign ministers, saying we now need to engage Iran. So the role Ahmadinejad played in uniting the international community against Iran, Rouhani is now creating potential fissures. That said, I think that it's going to be difficult for the P5+1 to offer meaningful concessions, and for the U.S. and Europeans to offer meaningful concessions if Iran isn't going to make meaningful nuclear compromises.
Mr. Nader, you laid out what you think a deal might look like. Do you think that the Russians and Chinese, for example, might take less given the new president?
I don't think they'll necessarily take less. We have to remember when Hassan Rouhani was National Security Advisor, Iran stopped uranium enrichment. And when Ahmadinejad became president in 2005, that was reversed. Now, Rouhani in his press conference yesterday said that those days are gone. We're not going to stop uranium enrichment, but I think there's potential to cap the Iranian enrichment program so they don't go up to 20%. They don't amass their stockpile, and I think this is something that is acceptable to the P5+1. And sanctions are going to continue no matter what, even if the Chinese and the Russians think Rouhani is more moderate.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. I just close by referring back to what Mr. Nader said at the beginning, that U.S. pressure is really just beginning to pay off, and we shouldn't be willing to let up on the pressure because there is someone who is less belligerent, being less bellicose. I think it's an important thing for all of us to remember, and I thank the witnesses, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to also thank Mr. Deutsch for those comments. I think it was good, and I kind of want to pick up on that, but first I want to say to the visiting delegation, also add a thanks. I've been to Georgia many times, and I was stationed in Kyrgyzstan with the military and Manas Air Base. So thank you for being here and your hospitality. And to the other two nations represented, hopefully we can come and visit you also someday. So thank you. And continue to press forward on your march towards freedom. We encourage you. In terms of the actual specific issue of Iran, Mr. Nader, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, I want to make sure I fully understood what you were saying. So you're advocating for, and I'm not arguing with you, I'm curious, because you're advocating for basically allowing Iran to go nuclear, but capping the level of enrichment to allow them to have a peaceful nuclear process. Now, let's say, and I'm not a technical nuclear guy, but let's say we cap them at 20% or whatever. How quickly could that be reversed? So if they agree to inspections, they agree to the cap, how quickly at the point our relationship falls apart again or whatever, can they either secretly or openly get to highly enriched uranium where they can marry it with a bomb? Let me just ask you that question.
So I don't advocate they go nuclear. We should make all efforts to stop Iran's development of a nuclear weapons capability. But the Supreme Leader has supposedly issued a religious ruling or fatwa stating that Iran does not want nuclear weapons. So let's let Iran operationalize that. Let's just have them limit uranium enrichment to 5% because they have to go to 20% and then higher to develop a nuclear
But
weapon.
then how long does that, and you may not be a technical nuclear guy, how long does the 5 to 20% take?
Well, Iran is under IAEA inspection, so anything they do is going to be monitored, and the goal is to make inspections even more intrusive, to have Iran open up some of the suspected nuclear sites to inspection. And Hassan Rouhani has said that he wants to be more transparent on the nuclear program. Let's give him a chance. If Iran does not want to be more transparent, then we impose additional sanctions and increase pressures on Iran.
And I know where you're coming from. My only concern is, again, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, if this was 10 years ago, I think we'd have the pleasure of time to be able to say, well, we can give it a couple of years and see if he's legitimate. But I really, personally, from all I've heard, we actually are up against Iran becoming a nuclear state. And so unfortunately, and I wish we did, unfortunately, I don't know if we have the luxury of being able to see how this develops and how this kind of rounds out. A concern I have too, and again, I want to encourage, I don't want the feeling to be from this committee, and I don't think this committee's given it yet, but I don't want the feeling to be, hey, to the people of Iran, we don't trust you, we don't believe that you really did what you went out to do, which is elect a moderate. But obviously, you can understand our concern because of the wall that we're up against. And what I saw in 2009, now I don't want to make this an attack on the administration today, but I will say I do believe that America lost a really big opportunity in 2009 for a serious uprising. And I'm afraid, I don't want to do that here as well. But let me ask another question. If we do find ourselves in this position of we are now facing a nuclear Iran, let's say it comes to be whatever the fall is or something like that, and this guy's in power, and I want to ask all three of you, what is preferable, to let this guy, to trust him enough to let him take Iran to a position where he wants to negotiate with the West, or to press forward on, i.e. military strikes to ensure that Iran does not become nuclear? So you're kind of faced with, we've got this guy in power, but on the other hand, we believe that they're going to go nuclear. We'll start with Mr. Sadjadpour. I hope I said that right.
I would just say that what I would argue Iran is doing with their nuclear program is taking a very incremental approach. They're simultaneously putting their foot on the gas and on the brakes, meaning they're expanding the number of centrifuges, they're expanding the sophistication of the centrifuges, but they're at the same time taking that stockpile of low-enriched uranium and converting it to fuel rods, which has been allaying some of the concerns of the Israelis. And I would simply argue that trying to dialogue and engage with this new Rouhani government, in my opinion, is a win-win. If we're able to make forward progress, we reach some type of détente, that's a win. If we don't, we expose them as the problem.
Dr. Maloney?
I don't think Rouhani changes the position of any of us or anyone in this town that we do not want Iran to have access to a nuclear weapon. What he does do is potentially provide the opportunity for a deal that is mutually tolerable. We believe that the will exists for that within the Iranian political establishment today. I know that it exists within the administration and within this building.
Well, thank you. And my time's expired, but I just want to say, look, I hope this works out to be something. Trust me, it would be nice to have this situation off the world's table. A military strike, as an example, against Iran would be terrible, but a nuclear Iran would be even worse. So hopefully this is maybe a miracle in the Middle East, but we'll see. I yield.
Thank you. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. If, in fact, it's the case that Rouhani was allowed to win in part because the Iranian people would not have reacted well to a more conservative candidate, that the outpouring would have been so strong, it seems to me we have two possible narratives. One is the Supreme Leader is actually trying to get Iran out of this box. And one has to ask, well, if that were the case, couldn't the Supreme Leader have done that directly, which would have been consistent with what the Iranian people want, which would seem to be a really good path? And so instead, is it more likely that what this Supreme Leader is attempting to do by allowing Rouhani to win is provide this safety valve so that people sort of are calmed down, and then to my friend Congressman Deutsch's point, to create an opportunity to really destabilize the international coalition that has really very strongly held together in the face of Iran's nuclear program. And doesn't that, in fact, put us in a very difficult position in terms of balancing both this opportunity, but at the same time safeguarding against this sort of opportunity that the Supreme Leader now has to dissipate some of the strength of the international coalition and to continue full speed ahead with the nuclear program? If that analysis is reasonable, what is the best way for us to respond? What are the best ways to sort of understand what the true motivation is?
You want me to go?
Yeah, I'd invite all of you to.
I think Khamenei wants to save face, and he couldn't compromise as long as Ahmadinejad was president, because in 2009 he strongly supported Ahmadinejad, and he's been saying for the last 8 years Ahmadinejad's policies are correct, and Ahmadinejad turned out to be disastrous for him, and this was embarrassing for him. So this provides an opportunity to make some of these key decisions with Rouhani as president. If the Rouhani experiment fails, Khamenei can say, well, it wasn't me, it was Rouhani. In terms of the P5+1, I just don't think a Rouhani presidency will weaken the coalition because the sanctions right now are not going to be reversed until Iran makes a move to build confidence among the international community. Even the Russians and Chinese, I think, are aware of this.
I think that your analysis is absolutely reasonable, but I do think that Khamenei took a big risk if that's what he did, because the safety valve of Rouhani risked putting people out in the streets in a way that they were in 2009, which is something that clearly Khamenei and the hardliners deeply, deeply fear. These young people shouting with joy, dancing around a particular color even, was something that played into his own paranoia about a soft revolution sponsored from the outside. But I think you're absolutely right to sort of believe that any possibilities are accurate right now in terms of the interpretation. And in terms of how it is we avoid getting sucked into an Iranian ploy, I think as actually both the fellow panelists have suggested, the best way to do that is to ensure that we continue to approach the negotiations with full seriousness, that we are prepared to meet the Iranians, any concessions from the Iranians with meaningful incentives for continuing and confirming those concessions. And if we, as Karim says, if in fact this is not serious, then we'll surely know that and we will strengthen the coalition. If it is, then we may find a way to at least turn down some of the urgency with respect to the nuclear concerns.
Well, the word cementing is in the title of the panel today, and I think cemented is a good adjective for the sanctions. It's going to be very tough to remove U.S. congressional sanctions, even the European oil embargo. So I think we shouldn't be too worried that the entire sanctions regime is going to suddenly fall apart just with Hassan Rouhani. With regards to the Supreme Leader's calculations, I sometimes think we confer on them too much strategic planning and Machiavellian brilliance than oftentimes is the case. I would say in this case it was simply a lot of ad hocry, and he probably didn't know that morning who was going to be president. But I would argue this, is that I actually think that Khamenei's image, his tattered image, has been rehabilitated in a way that many of us didn't anticipate, meaning I think he's far more popular now with the Iranian people than he was on June 13, 2013.
I think it just makes the point that the sanctions that we've imposed or that the international community has imposed with us are working, and we should just remain very cognizant of that as we move forward. And again, thank you for the testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Meadows is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Nader, I noticed that you kind of gave the back and forth when you said his tattered reputation was perhaps reinvigorated, and so I'd like you to go ahead and make your comments in a verbal manner, and so I can follow up on that.
With all due respect to Karim, who I think is a great analyst and is a friend, I think the Islamic Republic does not have a good reputation in Iran. I think the days of the Islamic Republic are numbered. I think that as long as Khamenei is alive, we won't see major change in Iran. But when he passes away, there will be an opportunity to have a better Iran, a more democratic Iran. And we have to keep in mind that Rouhani was not elected because the Iranians love him, as Karim said, but because they're desperate, because the regime
and they're desperate because of the economic conditions?
Because of the economy, because of inflation, because of unemployment, because of lack of social freedom, prostitution, drug use. I mean, this regime is destroying Iran, and its people realize it, and they seek a way out, and that was the only option available to them, to vote for Rouhani.
Dr. Maloney?
I can't gauge the current popularity of Ayatollah Khamenei. I never found him to be all that well liked when I had the opportunity to visit Iran. I do think that this is a boost for the regime, and obviously that makes our strategy now more complicated. But clearly, Iranians want a way out that does not involve disruptive change. They're not prepared to risk their lives on the street today for good reason. They know that they will be shot, thrown in jail, forced to leave the country and leave all their possessions and family behind. They want to find a moderate way, a sort of way to get out of this terrible set of circumstances that they're in.
So
gradual
a
change.
peaceful coup, is that what you're suggesting?
I think that would be the best possible outcome to what we've seen. I don't think it is the inevitable outcome to what we've seen.
Okay, but in your opening testimony, you were very positive, or at least more optimistic than most of the opening statements up here. And so what would you say are the two bright spots that you see in this election that we can celebrate with the Iranian people?
The most important part of this election actually wasn't the election itself. It was the debate that took place a week before the ballot, in which conservatives from across the board pounced on the nuclear negotiator and attacked the current strategy and the failure to have gotten a deal from the international community in the series of negotiations that have taken place. That, to me, was the most important. The other most important element is the fact that Iranians had the opportunity to carry through the messages they've been trying to get out since 2009 and have been too repressed to do, which is to go to the street, demand the freedom of political prisoners, demand opportunities to engage with the world, and actually celebrate the possibility of some optimism going forward.
So and this final question to each one of you, so what benchmarks do we put in place where we say, okay, well, these benchmarks have been met, and so sanctions can be lessened, or we can acknowledge progress here, and this is, what would be those benchmarks?
If I can go first, that Iran has an entirely peaceful nuclear program, uranium enrichment is capped, that Iran is
That's verifiable?
Subject to vigorous inspections, and it's verifiable, and Iran cannot move toward a nuclear weapons capability.
Okay, Dr. Maloney?
I would characterize it very similarly. I think there's a deal to be had that involves all of those elements, that provides greater transparency and reliability about our ability to foresee Iran's efforts to jump toward a nuclear weapon. But I think that we also have to be gauging what's happening within the country as well. I don't think we can simply disregard the political and social circumstances within the country.
Just want to make clear that I'm not trying to paint Ayatollah Khamenei as a positive, as a very popular guy, but, and I think the fact that the candidates aligned with him showed so poorly in the election is a reflection of that. But I'm simply arguing he's more popular now than he was before. With regards to prospects for political change in Iran, I simply say that in 1979, Iranians experienced a revolution without democracy. And I think today they aspire for a democracy without a revolution. There's not the same stomach to do what the Syrians are doing.
So do you see, any of you see realistically their withdrawal of supporting Hezbollah in Syria?
I would say no. As long as Ayatollah Khamenei remains supreme leader, the rejection of Israel's existence, support for groups like Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, and resistance against the United States, I would argue, aren't going to change.
If I can just add, I agree. I think the Islamic Republic will always oppose Israel, but I think Rouhani is going to be less ideological than Ahmadinejad. In his press conference, he referred to Israel instead of the Zionist entity. It's a very small gesture, but it's something. Does it show he's a true moderate? No. A true moderate would acknowledge Israel, but when you compare him to the rest, he's tad better, and I think that's just a little room for cautious optimism.
I appreciate the patience of the chair. I yield back.
Excellent question. Thanks, Mr. Nader. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just take this initial moment to welcome the women parliamentarians. It is an honor to have you here. We are glad you're here. Witnesses, thank you for your testimony. We are clearly at a moment of uncertainty as we watch the dust settle. Dr. Maloney, you mentioned the relevance of elections and the importance of even a semi-democratic process in an authoritarian context. I wonder if you could touch on a little bit any of whatever meaning there was in the turnout for the election and the fact that Mr. Rouhani was able to win on the first ballot.
I think this was huge. If I were an Iranian and I had been through what they had been through in 2009 when the vote was blatantly rigged and when the protesters who came out and demanded to know where their vote was were brutally repressed, I don't think I would have had the stomach to go to the polls, particularly after much of the hype surrounding the rejection of the candidacy of Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, who was seen as the primary moderate. So I think it is a tremendous testament to the faith of the Iranian people, their willingness to invest in highly imperfect institutions, and their willingness to continue to hope even in a situation that doesn't provide a lot of hope. The fact that Rouhani won on the first ballot was also a big surprise. It's always hard to tell where the political winds are going within Iran, and of course the social media buzz in the run-up to the ballot was very much favorable toward Rouhani, but of course that was the case back in 2009, and we didn't see the same outcome. So part of this goes to the disarray among the conservatives, their inability to unite behind a single candidate. And there I think we should remember that at least 49% of the Iranian people voted for someone who was moderately to extremely hardline. Right. And that should be a reminder of some of the constraints that we face.
Thank you, and that's a good lead into my next question. Is there any reason to think that the change in president should affect our calculus? We said earlier, changing benchmarks of our decisions when to strengthen sanctions, or conversely, looking for changes where we might lessen or pull back on sanctions?
I'll say just briefly, I think that the next step should be at the negotiating table. It should not be in this building, because I think if there's intensification of sanctions, Iranians themselves will read it as directed against their own action, and they, I will tell you, do not appreciate the sanctions. But in fact, our benchmark shouldn't change, but we can expect and hope, I think, to see a more serious set of negotiators, as Karim described, the people who were with Rouhani when he was handling the file 10 years ago. And I think we should be prepared to do more than offer the sort of spare parts for aircraft that has been kicking around now for a couple of decades. We should be prepared to give meaningful sanctions relief in exchange for meaningful concessions on the nuclear issue.
Mr. Sadjadpour?
I would agree with that, and I would simply say that for the Supreme Leader, I would argue rapprochement, or better relationship with the United States, is inimical to his interests. So when we actually make efforts to try to engage Iran and he rebuffs us, I think it makes him look very bad in the eyes of his people who desperately do want to emerge from isolation, and the rest of the international community.
And yet, Mr. Nader, you mentioned his press conference yesterday. In his press conference, in referring to the nuclear enrichment program, and I'll quote him, he said, "All should know that the next government will not budge from our inalienable rights." Does that lead us to have any hope that there is room for negotiation?
Yes, because I think there is a middle ground where we could recognize the right to enrich uranium as long as it's peaceful, especially if it's capped. And the Iranian elite always talk about the U.S. pursuing a logical position on the nuclear program, and that's often interpreted in Iran as meaning having a program, but also saving face. I mean, this is very important for them to show that sanctions and pressure have not worked on their decision-making, although I argue they have. So let's give them an off-ramp on this crisis. Let's give them an exit and allow them to exit the nuclear crisis, because we've built a lot of leverage against Iran, and it's time to use the leverage.
Thank you. I think that's an important point. And with my last few seconds, Mr. Sadjadpour.
Just say that I would argue that the Obama administration's unprecedented but unreciprocated overtures to Iran actually made this sanctions regime happen. So we should take that into account.
I think that's a good point as well. In the last few seconds, Iran is increasingly engaged in Latin America, South and Central America. Do you see Mr. Rouhani's election as having impact on their involvement, good or bad, within the Western Hemisphere?
Well, having lived in Latin America and Mexico, I'm confident that Iranian Shiite soft power isn't going to go a long ways, and that's part of the world. And they do have certain assets, aligned with Hezbollah. But after the death of Hugo Chavez, I think they've lost their chief ally in Latin America.
All right. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you so much. Dr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this incredible hearing in a timely manner with the elections in Iran. And I appreciate hearing from you guys, the experts, about this election in the dynamic with us in Iran. Additionally, I'm interested in knowing how this election will affect Iran's stance with both Syria and Israel. And I think this is something I hear from you guys, that we should tread cautiously about Mr. Rouhani as a so-called moderate, in lieu of what I've read here, that back in a newspaper in 1999, there was a student demonstration, and he took a real tough stance, declaring that those arrested for sabotage and destroying state property would face the death penalty if found guilty. That's a pretty tough stance. And then a former student was talking about how the guards broke into their dorm rooms and murdered students in front of them. And as recently as January, Rouhani stated that Syria has constantly been on the front line of fighting Zionism, and this resistance must not be weakened. And you're saying how we should continue forward to engage him. How would you recommend we engage him with that kind of a stance? And I've heard some overtones here, and I'd like to hear more specifically, and we'll start with you, Mr. Nader.
On the question of Syria, I see Iran's Revolutionary Guards and the Supreme Leader as determining Iran's position, and I don't feel like they're likely to budge on that issue. But it's also important to note that Rouhani has stated he wants to fix Iran's relations with key allies such as Saudi Arabia. During his press conference, he said the Saudis are our brothers. I signed the first security agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So if Iran's relations with the Saudis and some of the other Arab countries improve, we could see a change. In terms of how we should engage, I believe in bilateral negotiations with Iran. U.S. diplomats should be able to talk to the Iranians. Talking to the Iranians does not mean that we accept their regime. It's just a foreign policy tool at our disposal.
Okay. Dr. Maloney.
I would echo everything that Ali has just said. I think that Rouhani will be able to dig up quite a bit of very vociferous rhetoric from Rouhani on Syria, as well as a number of other issues. But he did speak during the campaign about the need for engaging in diplomacy, about the need for talks between the Assad government, the Assad regime, and the oppositionists, as he described them. That's more moderate rhetoric within the Iranian political discourse than the rest of the candidates certainly articulated. I think to the extent that he will have any influence on Syria, it will only be if he can make the argument that it is harming Iran's ability to repair its relationships with the world, and that comes back to the economy and his need to fix it. His ability to create confidence within the Gulf is going to be critical. He certainly, I think, assuages a lot of fears there about what direction Iran is going, and whether or not he's able to open up a channel of communication with Riyadh on this particular issue, I think, would be enormously important.
Mr. Sadjadpour.
I see very little likelihood that Iran will change its position toward Israel. I think rejection of Israel's existence is one of the three remaining symbolic pillars left of the revolution in the Islamic Republic. With regards to Syria, as someone once wrote, Syria is not America's Vietnam, it's Iran's Vietnam. Iran is bleeding very heavily in Syria. They've spent billions of dollars to keep Assad afloat, and Rouhani being, as I said, someone who sees economic expediency oftentimes trumping revolutionary ideology. If he has a role, I would argue that he would probably argue for a different approach. But it is going to be the Revolutionary Guards who continue to carry out Iranian policy in Syria, not the presidency.
Okay. We keep hearing about the continual creep towards developing a nuclear weapon and their nuclear program continuing. Do you see the day that they'll develop a weapon? If so, when? And if they do, what do we do?
Well, the U.S. intelligence community has assessed that the Iranian leadership has not made the decision to weaponize the program, that Ayatollah Khamenei has not made that decision. And this is a regime that bases its decisions on cost-benefit calculations. The costs for Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability are going up, and they could be reacting to the pressure. So as long as those costs exist, there's a good chance that they will not weaponize, especially if we maintain the pressure and make sure Iran is more transparent on its nuclear program, as Mr. Rouhani has claimed he would like to have more transparency.
Okay, Dr. Maloney.
I think the only confidence that we'll ever have about an Iranian nuclear capability is when there's a different government in place within Iran. It's not within our capability to achieve that today or tomorrow, but I think that ultimately what we have to be focusing on constantly is putting as much distance between this regime and a nuclear weapons capability as possible.
I would just echo Suzanne's comments.
Okay. I appreciate your time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. Mr. Vargas of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I'd also like to welcome the women parliamentarians and note that we have a woman chairwoman here, of course, and we're very proud of her on both sides of the aisle. Yeah, we are, por supuesto. You know, I think we all look at this through different lenses. I look at it a little bit differently maybe than most that have spoke so far. I see two differences between Ahmadinejad and now Rouhani, and that is that this guy's a cleric. The other guy wasn't. The other guy was somewhat of a ruffian. This guy's a sophisticate. This guy speaks 5 different Western languages. He speaks English. He was educated in Scotland. He speaks French. He speaks German. He speaks Russian. I think that it's going to be very interesting, the dynamic between the Supreme Leader and him, because they have a relationship on a different level that you don't have, I think, when you're not a cleric. I could see very easily that the Supreme Leader would say, hey, you know, I trust you. You're a cleric. Go out there and get me some time. You know, you're a sophisticated guy. Go out there and talk to the West in a way that this other guy couldn't. Gain us some time, because you can see that these sanctions are really hurting us. They'll trust you as they don't trust him. Now go out there and be soft. Look soft. You know, I have to say I'm very skeptical, because I could see that happening, and then the United States saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe we got a little thing going here with this guy. Let's back up. Let's ratchet back. Let's throttle back, when we should be doing the opposite, maybe, in tightening the sanctions down, because the sanctions do seem to be working. What do you think about that? I mean, again, we all look at it through different eyes. I'm a former Jesuit, so I look at it through the eyes of the cleric. I mean, here's a guy. These two people can trust each other at a level that normally you don't have. Anybody?
I can just go first briefly. You know, the issue with Ahmadinejad was that in Persian culture, you're supposed to respect your elders, even if you don't like them. And Ahmadinejad did not do that. It is more likely than not that Rouhani will maintain respect for the Supreme Leader and work within the parameters set for him by the Supreme Leader. Yes, he is charming. He's a mellow, calm guy. He's pragmatic. But I don't think he's going to be able to smile his way out of Iran's crisis. Again, we have to ensure that Iran is held accountable no matter how popular and how much opposite he is of Ahmadinejad. I think the fact that the international community is more positive toward him shouldn't mislead us into thinking that all of a sudden pressures on Iran are going to stop, because everybody realizes what the Islamic Republic is about, even if Rouhani is the president.
Doctor?
Very quickly, Rouhani and Khamenei have a relationship that dates back decades, and obviously that's going to help. It also helps explain how it is that he's gotten to where it is. But it's also important to realize that Khamenei has spent the past decade disparaging Rouhani's role, specifically in public, with Rouhani sitting in the audience. It's really remarkable. You don't often see that in the Islamic Republic. So, you know, he was forced to back down. He was forced to take someone whose position on the nuclear issue, which is obviously of critical importance to the regime, was not one that he has been articulating himself, but that he has been defending and advancing himself for the past 10 years. So I think that it's important that we see that there is this opportunity without in any way changing any of our own positions on the nuclear issue.
I think after 8 years of seeing the Iranian cup 80% empty, maybe it's time to look at it 20% full, just for once, to say, okay, this is a guy who is actually, as you mentioned, he studied abroad. His advisors were all U.S. educated. I think in his heart of hearts, he would probably prefer a better relationship with the United States. And I'm not concerned that he's going to be able to smooth talk his way out of sanctions without them making any meaningful concessions. I don't think that's a concern we should have.
Well, he seems like he's already smooth-talked us a little bit. I mean, just saying he's moderate and all these other things. I have great skepticism. I think, Reagan said trust but verify. Here I think it's verify and verify. Again, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Very good. Thank you. Congresswoman Meng?
I, too, want to extend a welcome to our women dignitaries here today. As our chairwoman and I are members of a body of less than 19% female, it's very encouraging to see you all here today. On one hand, we want to speak directly to the Iranian people, its women, and its youth. And on the other hand, we want to build up trust with the regime if we're going to negotiate successfully. What's the best way to manage these dual objectives?
Ultimately, I think regime change is up to the Iranian people. It is not up to the United States to change the regime in Iran. There are ways we can help, opening up communication, reforming Voice of America, like Karim said. But ultimately, the Iranian people will determine their own destiny. I think for now, we have to make sure that Iran stops its nuclear pursuits, and that we can verify it. And over time, especially once the supreme leader passes away, Iran will have an opportunity to seek a new future, possibly without the Islamic Republic.
I think we've already got some good programs in place that have been in many ways put on hold because of the atmosphere that Ahmadinejad and this recent political context within Iran helped to create, where it was dangerous for Iranians to participate in some of the international visitor programs and the other opportunities to come here. That's of some importance to many Iranians. But the highest priority for Iranians is economic opportunity. Economic opportunity can only come through restructuring of their economy, dealing with some of the long-standing mismanagement, but also in the removal of sanctions. What we can do best to serve the Iranian people is to respond to serious offers of concessions from its government on the nuclear issue with meaningful sanctions reform.
Not to belabor the point, but I think that we oftentimes underestimate the role that satellite television played in the uprisings in the Arab world, the role of Al Jazeera and Arabiya, and this model doesn't really exist in Iran. Upwards of 90% of Iranians rely on television as their primary news source, and it's basically either state television for their news or BBC Persian. We have a huge opportunity here with the Voice of America, which we're totally squandering. It's an unprofessional service. The quality of programming is terrible. And with this one thing, which costs less than an F-15 fighter jet, we can reach over 30 million Iranians.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Meng. Don't have anyone from our side, and don't have anybody here. Okay. Well, thank you very much for excellent testimony. It'll be interesting to see what the future holds with this new leader. And I hope that with this soft demeanor, he doesn't lull us into thinking that he's wearing the white hat, because reforms are difficult to come by as long as the supreme leader is calling the shots. And with that, the subcommittee is now adjourned. Thank you. Excellent panelists.